In the years of the 1930s, Newcourt was a city that was in the hands of the gangsters. Crime was ruled the day, with citizens being scared, the police were powerless, and politicians were bought off. And the top dog in the criminal underworld was Salvatore Zaza, also known as the Godfather, and was the head of the Zaza crime family. But things began to change as a masked man emerged from the shadows, driving around in a car that he called the Silver Phantom, aided by his partner, another masked vigilante, and waged war with the city's top gangland figures and other notable criminals. That man was Benjamin Benny Cohen, a city councilman, but to the city of Newcourt, he was known as the Masked Dragon. I'm Harrison Phillips, city historian, and a butler to the Cohen family. I'm writing a series of entries about the Dragon's exploits, all of his adventures, all the crimes that were committed in the city, and all the criminals he and his allies brought to justice. In today's story, we see the Dragon's team take down one of Newcourt's most infamous prostitution racket bosses. And it is here that Danny Green meets a woman named Carmela Vinci, who was also a fallen victim to the gangster lifestyle, and is essentially a mobster's girlfriend. This is the Dragon's Wars. We begin this story in the early months of 1935, February I believe. It was a cold, rainy night in a section of the city called Wild Nightlife. Yeah, I know, silly name. A woman was walking down the street only to run into a local hood, muscling her for money. It was a local pimp, telling her to hand over her money, and just as he turned around, it was the Masked Dragon who was behind him. And they, well, began to fight.
My name is Luca.
After it was over, he handed all the money he had to the girl, and then he told her to scram. He then turned over to the thug and began to interrogate him. He then knocked him out, got in his car, and drove off to HQ. As soon as the Masked Dragon got back, Lepke came forward and asked did he get any information from the thug. He said no, but then he turned to the board with names and pictures of all the higher-up capos in the prostitution racket. There were 3 that the team had already taken down. The 3 that the team had already taken down and are serving several life sentences in prison include Salvatore Bazzini, Salieri Tattaglia, and Morello Stracci. However, there was one that they couldn't catch. That man was Frank the Ladies' Man Corleone. He had been pretty much under the radar for at least 2 months. And they couldn't find his whereabouts. And this was really getting to Mr. Cohen. He had searched high and low, but it seems that he almost vanished into thin air. Just as Mr. Cohen was about to leave for a charity event with Hillary Scott, Lepke showed him a new gun that he was inventing for him to use, a special gun that fires knockout darts, and this was because he felt that they didn't need to drop too many bodies. The gun ironically, would become the trademark to the Masked Dragon's arsenal. Now, if you were wondering where are Tony and Danny are, well, they're at Danny's bakery. It was a big day and he needed some extra hands, and Tony offered to help. Just as the day was coming to a close, a woman walked in. Her name was Carmela Vinci, a woman whom both Danny Green had a crush on since childhood. The two were best friends, but each other went down a different path, as we all know. Her story was tragic. She wanted to be essentially a star, but she couldn't put her foot through the door, and as a result had to turn to other avenues to support herself. She ended up selling her body to a local brothel, until one day she was spotted by a higher-up mobster who took a liking to her and made her his girlfriend. At first, she liked being a mole, a term for mobster girlfriends back then. But then he began to abuse her, and she feared ever leaving him. Just as they finished talking and taking her order, but that all quickly ended, as all of a sudden, Frank the ladies' man walked into the bakery and began to verbally abuse her and violently dragging her away. Just as Danny was about to grab a baseball bat, Tony told him to stop, and they said they followed them to a local hotel. It was called the Cool Off House, and it was a break that they needed. They went back to HQ and explained everything, what they saw. They needed an insider to get in, and as it turns out, they needed someone pretty. Just as they realized this, they all turned to Hillary to see if she was up to it. Miss Hillary said yes. That night, Hillary Scott went in, wearing a wig and dressed in some clothing that made men's blood run. They used to joke about it to Mr. Cohen, to which he felt embarrassed Now, during the night, Hillary ran into Carmela, and the two developed a friendship that night. The two ended up talking, and she would tell her that she wanted out, but she had no one to turn to. She said that if she wanted to, she could help, and just as the conversation ended, Hillary got up and walked to the window, opened it up, and the masked vigilantes climbed up and walked in, and shouted that it is a raid, and the gangsters began to fire. At the end, the ladies' man himself, Mr. Corleone, held a gun at the demon's head and threatened to shoot him unless the masked dragon backed off. And just as he was about to back off, Carmela ended up throwing a glass bottle at Mr. Corleone's head, and Hillary threw a knife in his back. And well, Mr. Corleone was dead. After that event, Carmela, with Hillary's support, would go to Detective Warren and confess everything. It was her testimony that would bring down all the prostitution rackets in not only Wild Nightlife District, but all the districts in New Court. She would then go to Danny for help at starting over. And not only would Mr. Green offer her a job working at the bakery, but 2 days later, he revealed his identity to her, showing he was the demon, and the two began dating, and they stayed together ever since. When I asked Mr. Cohen what he thought about those two dating, he said that they were just two lovebirds. I also asked if he ever considered showing his real identity to Miss Scott, but he said, maybe someday, but not today. Just as he completed that sentence, he said that he had to get going, as he had a double day. It was him, Hillary, Carmela, and Mr. Green. And that is the end of today's story. Please join us next time as the masked dragon and the demon go up against the mob in our next adventures in the Dragon's Wars.